Hello, today's video is going to be a time lapse of a hummingbird painting that I was working on, and I believe I started this 2 summers ago, and I did a series of hummingbird paintings, and this was one of them. So I am getting out some color to paint for the background, and I do have my bird masked with masking tape, and I do have a video on my YouTube channel that shows how I use the masking tape and why I like masking tape over masking fluid, even though sometimes I'll still use masking fluid. And I am starting by wetting the background because I'm going to paint the background wet on wet so that it has a soft focus feel. And I think that is some cerulean and some cobalt that I'm using in the background, or it might be cobalt and some phthalo blue turquoise. And the idea for this painting was that the bird was sort of above me and I was seeing some of the blue of the sky and some of the foliage of the plants or trees that were around that area. And so I just kind of liked that look, and also the bird is backlit so it gets a glow on the edges of the wing and the head. And because these paintings were done a few summers ago, I am not positive what colors I'm using, so I'll be guessing on some of that, but in this background I think I have some perylene green, that's that darker green, and possibly mixed with some new gamboge for parts that are a kind of olivey green color. And then I do let this area dry because I want to see how that first pass of color worked, and then I can decide if I want to add another layer or if it's working. And your color is going to be 20 to 30% lighter once it dries, and you can see that it did lighten. It's not quite dark enough, so I am getting more color out. And whenever you're doing a wet on wet passage, whether it's a big background or some other part of your painting, it's important to have your color out first so that you're not scrambling to get color as the painting or the paper starts to dry. So I think I might have added some sap green with some new gamboge in the second pass, and maybe some more of the perylene green because I wanted to darken everything, and I don't think I added anything to the blue area. And then I do go back with my brush, and that is my number 20 silver black velvet brush, so it's nice and big but gets a good point. And I was lifting some of the color around the edges of the tape to make sure that it didn't cause a bloom in that area. And I did go pick up some of the darker colors, possibly the perylene and maybe some blue mixed with it, and I splattered that on by tapping my big brush on a smaller brush, and that does give some texture and pattern in the background that can kind of represent foliage and a little bit of a abstract feel. The brush that I used just a second ago, that was a mop brush, and the mop brush can be very helpful if you are trying to cause some area to not possibly bloom, where color pushes into a drier area and causes a cauliflowery effect, or if you want to blur and possibly soften an area, that brush can be very helpful for that. I do think I have a video on that as well, so you might look that up. Just on anyone's YouTube channel where there's that magnifying glass, if you don't know, you can type in a subject, and sometimes if they have a video that they have a tag for that video with the same word, then you can search for those things. So for my videos, you don't have to scroll through all the videos. You can just go and type in mop brush or masking tape, and some of those videos that I have available will come up. So for the bird, I am starting with one of the lighter values on the body, and I do believe I was using Quin Burnt Scarlet and a little bit of cobalt and possibly some Quin Rose in parts of those mixes, so that I'd have some warmer areas kind of reddish brown, and then some cooler areas sort of more on the purples. And then before I moved on to anything on the wings, I do take a flat brush, and this flat brush is a little stiffer bristle, and go in and I blurred some of those edges, especially the tips of the wings, because on this particular bird I did catch the action of the bird with my digital camera, and so there are a little bit of a softer edge feel to the wings, but most of the bird is in focus. And I do work from my own photographs, so I have pictures of hummingbirds when I've gone to someone else's house, or on either at my backyard or when I'm out somewhere up in the mountains, and I've caught some birds there as well. Generally around a feeder is easiest because they move very quickly, as you know, with hummingbirds. And I am starting to add layers to the wings, and I find I work best if I slowly build the color, and usually I will build it a little slower in the beginning because I'm sort of getting a foothold of where everything is and whether my values are what I want, and it just sort of gives me a roadmap for how I want to lay everything out on the bird. And I tend to, as I said, put the lighter values on first, and then I will add layers to darken them, and then at some point I will come in with a darker value just so that I can start to relate everything and see if my other layers need to be darkened or if I need to lighten anything. For this area, I think I might be using Quin Gold and possibly a little bit of the Quin Burnt Scarlet to give a little bit of an oranger area in parts of it. And the bird was lit from behind, so he does have, he or she, I should say, because I'm not positive if it's a female or a male. Sometimes for the hummingbirds, the juvenile birds can look more like a female because their feathers aren't fully in yet. And this bird was lit from above, and so it's got edges of really highlighted around the head and the wings, and so I want to make sure I'm going around those white areas. And I don't use opaque paint, so I don't use gouache or white watercolor or any of that. I use the white of the paper for my whites. And you may not see a dryer, but every now and then I do pause and I will dry parts of the painting. So when I'm adding another layer, most of the time that first layer is completely dry before I move on. For that area right there, I am actually adding color and then using a little water to soften some of the edges so that it still has a softer feel and it kind of blends into the first layer. And by painting this way, it gives me the ability to darken something without maybe pushing it too dark too quickly. With watercolor, as most of you probably know, you tend to work light to dark, and with other paints, other mediums, you might work dark to light. And so I don't have the option of bringing back those highlights, so I tend to want to move slowly and make sure that I'm not going to lose those. I can lift color, but you don't always get it back to that glowing white of the paper when you do that. So there you can see I did go in and put a darker value in on the wing, and that was the Quin Burnt Scarlet and probably ultramarine blue, because as I wanted to get darker values in there, I switched to the ultramarine because it is a darker blue and would give me that darker value. And then I'm using my flat brush to lift a little bit of the edge above the bird's head so that I could round it out a little more, and then I started painting in a few of the feathers up there. For those of you that are newer to my channel, I have had a YouTube channel for quite a while, and this last year I was just very busy, and so I hadn't put out a video in a while, but I'm trying to get back in the swing of things, and so I may be putting out a video about once a month. And so I hope if you're new, you will subscribe and like my videos and check out all the other videos I have available. I have lots of watercolor tip and trick videos prior to this, and then there's some other class videos and things like that. And also check out my website. I do have video lessons that I did originally as online classes available on there. Right now there's 6 of those, and then I do teach online and in-person classes, so you can get on my newsletter and you'll get I can't talk. You'll get announcements when I have new classes or other things available. So please check out my website, and you'll see the link at the end of the video. And as I am working on the bird's head, I used phthalo blue green shade and some permanent alizarin crimson mixed together to make the black of the eye. And that's my favorite black mix. I know some artists have other favorite mixes, and you'll get your own, but I use that for the eye and the beak. And I tend to, after I've gotten a certain point on a bird or a face or an animal, get the eye and parts of the face in so that I can see if those are working. And generally, if I'm happy with that, then I will continue. And you can see I'm still building, so I did add another layer to the body. And it can take a while as you're starting to add layers to really know if what you've got is dark enough. And so you'll see me go back to areas several times. And then also with birds, I build it in layers because I am adding texture that will look like feathers. And so I'm not necessarily trying to describe every feather, but I'm making little marks on the body or on the wings and tail that will make it feel feather-like. And you can see here I'm going back to the wing because it needs to be darker so that it will feel like it's lit from behind, and it would be shadowed on this side. And that is probably the ultramarine blue and Quin burnt scarlet mix to make a purple that's not too vibrant. Right now I'm using a smaller brush, and I tend to use the biggest brush I can for an area until I start needing to get into little details. And I think that's probably my number 6 silver black velvet brush. And those brushes are a blend brush, so that means they have both natural hair and synthetic bristles, and they hold a lot of water and paint, and that makes it easier for me to paint and not have to constantly go back to my palette. And also they come to really good points, and so I can get into small areas and make the marks I need to when I'm painting. I'm continue to use the Quin burnt scarlet for a lot of this bird, but you can see on that one side right now where I'm painting, it's more in shadow, so it's a cooler color, so that mix may be ultramarine blue with a touch of rose, or possibly ultramarine blue in the Quin burnt scarlet, but more blue in the mix. And as I said, it's been long enough I can't remember exactly. And then in parts of the belly, I may have switched to my Quin Sienna, and Quin Sienna is a really good color for hummingbirds. It's a rusty orange brown, and I like it better than the burnt sienna for the parts of hummingbirds that feel like they're sunlit and they're really glowing, especially for rufous hummingbirds. Quin Sienna is great for the feathers. And then on this side, on this wing, it definitely had a lot of kind of muted purple, and so that's probably the ultramarine blue and the Quin burnt scarlet, but just a lot of the blue in the mix, not as much of the burnt scarlet. And that gives me a more muted purple color. If I'm using a really vibrant purple, that would be a little too intense probably for this image. So you can see I started that wing with that lighter layer, and then I do come back later and I darken it. But that first initial layer is my way of, as I may have said, giving me sort of a roadmap. It gives me that first base layer to guide where I end up putting those darker colors, and maybe some of that first layer will peek through. But by putting that first layer on, I get an idea of where everything is, but I've not overcommitted. So at that point, if I put that first layer on and I decide, oh, I don't like that shape, or maybe I want to change my color, then I still can without it causing too much of an issue. And I am starting to build the tail feathers. I am placing more color on. I think that might be my third layer down there. And I'm making little marks. Sometimes it's possibly on slightly damp paper that's either colored and I get some soft edges, or it might be on dry paper. And you can see I'm continuing to darken that wing on the left side. Okay, well, I think this is the area where I paused to do something else. And so I just wanted to mention that I do have a video on how I stretch my watercolor paper. And basically I put my drawing on my watercolor paper and then I wet it on both sides because I use 140-pound cold press, either Fabriano or Arches watercolor paper. And so I want my paper to not buckle and have hills and valleys while I'm painting. So basically by stretching the paper I can keep it smoother as I'm painting. So once I have it wet, and I use my kitchen sink if the paper is small enough, and I just wet both sides, then once it kind of flops over, and it usually just takes a minute or two to kind of flop over, and I'll wet it a few more times. Then I lay it on my white board that you can see in the video here. It's called Gator Foam Board, and I can staple it down. Once it's stapled down and completely dry, then I will come back and put tape on the edges. I usually don't have to on the small paintings, but now I've started liking those nice clean edges. But for big paintings, especially, if I staple a paper down, and because it's 100% cotton, it might shrink up enough that it pulls some of those staples, so I will tape bigger paintings for sure. And now back to the painting. All right, so I am taking a flat brush and lifting a little bit here and there on that lower section because those lighter feathers are going to give me even more texture. And so sometimes you paint directly and other times you might lift color back. And so you can adjust values by lifting, but you can also use it for texture. And in this case, for the bird, it does add to the feeling of feathers. The paint that I have on my palette is mostly Daniel Smith, but I do have some Holbein pigments as well. And I use mostly transparent color, so the colors I'm using are not going to kind of cover over each other a lot. I mean, they will, but they're not opaque, so you get a glow or you get layers. You can see through those layers very easily with a transparent paint. Now, as you get a darker value, you don't necessarily see the same amount as you would if you're using lighter values. Okay, I don't know that that just made any sense. I hope it did. As I said recently to a class I was teaching, sometimes you say things and then you're just like, wait, what was that? What did I just say? All right, so on the tail there, I did go in and I put some kind of the rusty brown color, and that's that Quinn Burnt Scarlet, and possibly a little bit of blue mixed with it. And I am just kind of getting in that first layer on all of those. And you kind of know the drill now that how I am going through this process of adding a first layer and then building it. So you may not see the dryer, but I am waiting for feathers to dry before I paint the next section, just so that I'm not having the colors move and blur across each other. And then on some of the edges of the tail feather, I noticed that those edges are a little soft, and so I'm coming in with my flat brush to lift and adjust those edges so that they'll be a little blurry feeling, especially the very lit feathers that look very white on the edges, because very sunlit areas can have kind of a hazy or soft edged feel. As I explained earlier, you can't always tell if it's a female or a male hummingbird, especially if it's a juvenile hummingbird. And I think this might be a broadtail. I was actually at a friend's house and they had several feeders out, and so I was taking pictures there. They were attracting, I think they attracted all 4 hummingbirds that we get in this area. And so I was in hummingbird heaven, as it were, taking lots of photographs. And I use a digital camera and with a high shutter speed, so I can capture the bird and stop the action, but sometimes get those blurry wings. So those tail feathers are darker in parts, and that's that quinburnt scarlet with probably ultramarine blue. And I am letting some of that first layer peek through in parts of those feathers. So, you know, sometimes you might think, well, why did you put that lighter color down? You're just covering over it. But it depends on what the subject is and what I'm painting. Sometimes that lighter color will peek through in parts of it. You may not always see it in the videos, but you can definitely see that kind of thing on the painting. And in general, I tend to put paint around my paintings, kind of overall in parts of the, over the whole thing as I'm working. This one, because it's one bird, it's not a variety of birds in the scene, you are now focused on just painting the tail feathers in, and because we've got most of the bird done. And so as I start to get those layers on the tail feathers, I will sometimes focus on one tail feather and get most of the details in. But I usually try to wait on putting details in until I've pretty much got paint everywhere. And so that tends to be how I paint. However, if I'm painting something really detailed, like some glass or metal with lots of reflective things in those shapes, then I might focus on an area and really bring that area close to finish before I might move on. So for this bird, because most of the upper part is done, then I'm continuing to focus on the tail feather and slowly just paint each of those areas. But you can see I'm still moving around. I don't necessarily focus completely on one tail feather. I just keep adding layers where I need them. And I did decide then that lower part of the body where it connects to the tail needed to go darker. So I added another layer to that. I tend to have a towel in my left hand all the time, and that towel that I'm using is now a flour sack towel. I used to use paper towels all the time, and I would let my paper towels dry because I'd use the Viva brand, and then I'd reuse them until they started to fall apart. And then I found the flour sack towels, and I buy mine through Target, but you can get them other places. And they are a kitchen-sized towel that I cut down into 4 smaller towels, and I think they work really well. They don't always clean completely back to white anymore. In fact, most of mine are stained gray now. So, and I do wash them in the washer just with the regular shampoo and the regular laundry, and you can bleach them, but even by bleaching them, they didn't come completely clean. It did take out more color though. Okay, so on those tail feathers, I am really getting focused on trying to get them finished, and so I'm putting in the darker lines and some of the darker little marks that make it feel like a feather. And most of this is on dry paper, so as you can see, that background was wet on wet. possibly the body was wet on wet when I painted that first layer on. But as I start to paint smaller shapes and things, or I want hard edges, I don't put water down first. One of the things to note when you are painting with watercolor is if you are putting paint on your paper and it feels like the paintbrush is sort of skipping over the painting, or you've got really rough edges as you're trying to make a line or a shape, it may be that you don't actually have enough water in your mix and the brush is grabbing a hold of the surface of the paper. And so if you will add more water to your mix, and that may mean that you need to get out more pigment as well, depending on how dark you want something, by adding more water, you should have a smoother action to the brush as you're painting across the area, whether it's a line or, like I said, if you're making a shape. Don't be afraid of the water, but it can be something to practice. So yeah, just that little tip can sometimes make a big difference on how your paint is getting applied to your paper. So you can see now I'm adding those darker little feathers that are on most necks of hummingbirds, and they are kind of a purpley or blue on the more shadowed side of the neck and a little browner on the other side. And then I put the feet in, and I believe I'm using the same mix, the phthalo blue and permanent alizarin crimson, as I did for the eye and the beak. And then I am softening a few feathers right around the tail part of the body because those little areas were glowing, and so I needed to lift that back out. And then just a few more feathers here and there. And as we finish up, I hope you will give my videos a look and subscribe and like them, please, so others can find them. And check out my website for any classes or video lessons or any paintings that you would like to view. I also have a blog on there, so you can get more watercolor information that way as well. And just a few more layers here and there, and it's a good idea to get back from your painting, look at it backward, just stand back from it every now and then, and you might see things that need adjusting. And so even though you may not see it here, I don't often paint for hours. This bird probably took about 3 hours. And then I'm just darkening up some of the values and we will get it finished. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you again, and happy painting. Thanks. Bye.